Hello and welcome back to Japan Memo, the IISS Japan Chair podcast. This is the third episode of what has been a very packed 2025 already. I'm Robert Ward, Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy here at the IISS. And in these Japan Memo podcasts, we're joined by experts, strategists and practitioners to analyse why Japan matters in today's regional and global geopolitical landscape. Today, we're excited to welcome three more fantastic guests, Dr. Bart Gaens, Tatsumi Yuki, and Dr. Alice Dell'Era, to discuss Japan's role in minilateral frameworks in the Indo-Pacific. Before we get into the discussion, I'd like to introduce our wonderful guests. Bart is Senior Research Fellow at the Global Security and Governance Research Programme at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, FIA, in Helsinki, Finland. He's also one of the Japan Chair family. He's Japan Chair at the International Centre for Defence and Security, ICDS in Tallinn, Estonia, and holds the title of Docent at the Faculty of Arts at the University of Helsinki. He's worked as Professor of Japanese Studies at the University of Helsinki and as specially appointed Associate Professor at Osaka University in Japan. Bart has published on various topics including Europe-Asia relations, Japan's foreign policy and security-related issues in the Indo-Pacific region. One of his latest publications is Japan's Multi-Layered Security Strategy, Deterrence, Coalition Building and Economic Security, which was published in a FIA briefing paper. Welcome, Bart.
Thank you for having me.
And our second speaker is Yuki. Yuki is Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the East Asia Programme and Director of the Japan Programme at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. Before joining Stimson, Yuki worked as Research Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, and as the Special Assistant for Political Affairs at the Embassy of Japan in Washington, D.C. She's an expert on Japanese security policy, the US-Japan alliance, and US foreign policy in Asia. Her most recent publication includes Balancing Between Nuclear Deterrence and Disarmament, Views from the Next Generation, which was published by the Stimson Center. Welcome, Yuki.
Thank you, Robert, for having me.
And our third guest is Alice Dell'Era, and she is Assistant Professor at the Department of Security Studies and International Affairs at Embry, Riddle, Aeronautical University in Florida in the US, with a wonderfully located office, I think, near the beach, so we're all very envious of that. And she's also Research Fellow of the China and Indo-Pacific Desk, geopolitica.info, which is an Italian think tank looking at geopolitical studies. Her research centres on the geopolitical and security dynamics of the Indo-Pacific, with a particular focus on Japan's foreign and security policy and the extensive network of US alliances and partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. Her latest publication is called From Strategic to Tech-Oriented Minilateralism, GCAP as a Platform to Accelerate Military Technology Development, which was written for the International Spectator, an Italian journal on international affairs. So a warm welcome, Alice.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Let's start our discussion on Japan and minilateralism with thinking about some context for the subject, in particular the development of minilateralism in the Indo-Pacific. If we start with the background of the development of minilateralism in the Indo-Pacific region, after the Cold War, the Indo-Pacific regional architecture was primarily shaped by the US-led hub and spokes bilateral system and, of course, the ASEAN-led multilateral framework. We need to define minilateralism as well, a cooperative framework consisting of 3 to 5 states that lies between bilateral and multilateral. And this began to emerge in the 2000s. But how, in your view, has minilateralism evolved in the Indo-Pacific?
As you say, minilateralism is certainly not a new phenomenon. It's been around for several decades, and I think it especially provided a solution in multilateral contexts initially, when large groupings could not find a common response to a joint problem. And that's where then smaller groups of countries come in, so-called coalitions of like-minded countries starting to form, that were then aiming to tackle specific challenges that could then be done more efficiently than the larger multilateral frameworks. Basically, it's very simply based on the reality that smaller multilateral groupings are more flexible, more pragmatic, and more focused, and as such can offer a solution when the larger groupings do not offer a way forward, simply because these larger groupings often emphasize inclusivity, consensus-based decision-making, and so on. I remember doing some work on interregionalism in the early 2000s. So I was doing research on the Asia-Europe meeting, which at the time was a multilateral gathering of over 40 Asian and European countries. And very often it was hard to come to common solutions and common positions. So that's where minilateralism was actually institutionalized within this ASEM gathering. It was called issue-based leadership and later tangible cooperation. And it basically allowed a small group of countries to step up and to together launch initiatives in areas of shared interest. Already at the time, it was said that this was an especially useful tool for Asian countries who tend to very strongly emphasize sovereignty, non-interference, and so on. For them, minilateralism was a very flexible foreign policy instrument, allowing to cooperate on issues of interest with some countries without having to agree on absolutely everything with all of the countries. For that reason, I think it has also been quite an important policy instrument underlying integration in Southeast Asia through ASEAN, for example. But if you think about it further, minilateralism has also been at the core of European Union integration. It has been called differentiated integration, and it has offered groups of member states the chance to integrate at a slower pace, for example, even to opt out of certain policy regimes, while then other groups of states drive forward a certain policy. So things like multi-speed Europe, variable geometry, are also forms of multilateralism, and they have been key instruments also for the European Union. And perhaps the Schengen Agreement of 1985 is an early example of that. Now, having said that, I think that multilateralism has certainly grown in importance as of the 2010s in the Indo-Pacific, resulting in structures like the Quad, the Trilateral Strategic Dialogue between the US, Japan, and Australia, and many other trilateral dialogues involving India, Japan, and Australia. And it has further, I think, increased in importance during recent years. In the 2020s, there has been the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative between India, Japan, and Australia of 21. And there has been the Squad, the US, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines quadrilateral that was created in 2024. What I would say is the most important change compared to 20 years ago is that minilateralism is no longer seen as complementary to or an instrument for multilateralism or regional integration, but that now it has become a goal in and of itself, to the point that you can say that now it's basically the new name of the game, especially in the Indo-Pacific.
New name of the game. Perhaps we'll come back to that in a minute. Alice, you have China expertise to wheel China into the room. How has China's regional expansion affected the growth of minilateralism? Because clearly there are sort of two things going on here. One is what Japan and others are trying to do, and part of that is what's been happening with China. So could you illuminate for our listeners the China aspect to this?
The China factor has been one of the main driving forces in the proliferation of US-led minilaterals. We can see this not just more recently under the Biden administration, but even if we go back to previous administrations. For example, if we think about the first Trump administration, strategic documents at the time, the National Defense Strategy, and as well as the Department of Defense Indo-Pacific Strategy Report, were emphasizing minilateral networks by calling for the creation in the Indo-Pacific of a networked regional security architecture. And this kind of language coexisted and coincided in the same documents with the designation of China as a revisionist power and strategic competitor. So minilateralism has kind of emerged as the preferred approach amidst rising competition with China, obviously. And we can see this not just if we think about the Quad and the revival of the Quad in 2017, but also if we take other minilaterals as examples. The Japan, Philippines, US trilateral, for example, gained traction precisely in response to Beijing's assertiveness in the South China Sea. And even AUKUS centers on cooperating to co-develop advanced critical technology with the goal of maintaining the technological edge over China. Minilaterals are seen as more flexible instruments to address these strategic competition with Beijing. From the US perspective, they are seen as more flexible instruments to counter Beijing and win or attempt to win the strategic competition. But for regional actors, there are also options to more flexibly manage great power rivalry. One thing that I also would like to point out is that if so far this competition with China has sustained the so-called minilateral momentum, the deepening divide between Washington and Beijing also poses challenges to the sustainability of some of these frameworks, given that members often have different views or ideas on how to manage the challenges posed by China. I would add the challenges potentially posed by the United States. further intensification of this rivalry between the US and China could create internal frictions that can undermine and weaken some of the unilateral frameworks that we are seeing in the region.
Alice, you're talking about the US there, the proliferation of minilaterals in the region, they're sort of overlapping, which has given us this, I think, what's known as a lattice work structure. But the minilaterals seem to be grafted onto relations that the various countries have with the US. The US sort of functions as a foundation for the minilaterals that we've been talking about. Yuki, could you add a bit of colour to the US's role in creating these multilateral relationships, particularly given the uncertainties that we're seeing going forward with regard to the US's engagement in the region?
I do believe that key driver for this proliferation of that minilateralism, if you will, is really driven by their overall convergence on the regional countries' view vis-a-vis China, that Chinese behavior politically, militarily, paramilitarily, and also economically has grown increasingly aggressive and coercive. No one country can go up against such a huge country alone, and it needs to be a coalition approach to this. I would definitely agree with Bart that some of these minilaterals have been driven by U.S. and I do argue also in some aspect other U.S. allies like Japan and Australia is probably not so much in Australia. I think they do have a more nuanced view about this. Primarily U.S. and Japan's frustration about some of these bigger multilateralism, specifically speaking, ASEAN's approach, which is very consensus-based, non-interference in internal affairs. It is clear how little progress that South China Sea issues have been making, as long as the dialogue has been kept within the ASEAN-centric approach. So I think some of this multilateralism trend line is really driven by this frustration about the traditional style of consensus-based dynamics that have existence in this region. And if you talk about the all this multilateralism and multilateral framework, trilateral, quad, I'm saying with you, Robert, that I totally missed on the squad portion until very recently, until my colleague mentioned it. U.S. is definitely a common thread in all this, but then I would also highlight U.S.-Japan often as a pair that are common thread in most of these multilaterals. And then I would probably argue that AUKUS is probably the only notable exception that Japan is not involved. But then even then, I think I joined toward the end of the Biden administration, U.S. and Japan so far bilaterally agreed that Japan and AUKUS partners will begin a consultation to path a way toward Japan's partial participation in some of those advanced technology cooperation. So I think a U.S.-Japan converging view on the regional order and how the regional order should be preserved more similar to what the region has been enjoying up to this point, which is role-based, norm-based, no use of coercive measures to change the status quo kind of regional architecture needs to be preserved. I think there's a very striking convergence of both Tokyo and Washington's view on this. So I think that also is a very resilient driver, because a lot of the cases with all these different combinations of the countries, for example, U.S., Japan, India, U.S., Japan, Philippines, and for a while, U.S., Japan, Vietnam, also we've been talking about. Many of those third countries, it is rather the Japan that has a longer history of engagement and deeper history of engagement. So time and time again, you have seen the examples in this trilaterals and minilaterals where maybe it does include the third country where U.S. may be having a little bit of a challenge in terms of bilaterals relations, but Japan doesn't. So by going in as U.S.-Japan as almost like a pair kind of makes it a little bit more practical for the third countries to come in. So I'll just leave it at that for now. I'm sure others would like to join in too.
Bart, you wanted to come in?
Yes, I agree with Yuki, and I think it's important to also take into account the role of Japan, for example, in driving forward these constructions. But I do think it's important to also emphasize the role of the US and in instigating and starting up this system of so-called lattice network of overlapping layers of security constructions at the bilateral, at the trilateral, and at the quadrilateral levels. And I think this goes back to the Obama era. and the so-called pivot to Asia. The Assistant Secretary of State at the time, Kurt Campbell, has been writing about this, saying that, the explicit goal was to, you have the hub and spokes system at the core, but the US at the time was very much trying to create a tire around that system that interlinks all the different allies and like-minded partners together without direct US involvement. The US has, for example, been very, very active in trying to get Japan and South Korea come closer together and cooperate and establish stronger ties. So I think all these different political relations between countries like Japan, Philippines, India, Australia, but also Vietnam and even South Korea has been very much done based on what the US has been trying to promote.
Alice, yes, do come in.
Yes, I completely agree with Yuki and Bart's points regarding the role of the US and US-Japan as a pair. And I want to add one short point regarding the role of the United States. And I think we can see, as Bart mentioned, that push by the US to create this overlapping network goes back to the Obama administration. One of the novelty of, I think, the Biden administration was to push for these networks to cut across regions, no longer just facilitating overlapping networks between the spokes within the Asian region, but also kind of creating connections across regions. That was one of the main changes that I think occurred under the Biden administration.
You said, Yuki, that this Japan-US convergence is important for the broader frameworks in the region. Does that still hold, given the uncertainties that we're seeing?
From Tokyo's perspective, I can definitely see their will to try to hold it together, but it takes two to dance, especially with this talk about tariffs, automotives, steel, aluminum. That's supposed to be, if it does go into effect, as he has been threatening all along, and the first wave comes in April 2nd, and the other one comes in like early May, then that could certainly, on the economic and trade front, could change the dynamics quite a bit. But at the same time, on the military side, I do think that even with this current Trump administration, the view about challenges posed by China, they're very much seeing eye to eye on this. The only difference that I would actually be watching a little bit closely is the approach toward Taiwan, because there certainly has been a mixed signal coming out of depending on who in Trump administration has been speaking. You have seen the National Security Advisor, and then also Trump 1.0's former National Security Advisor keep talking about, China threat. We got to defend Taiwan, on one hand, but then as I'm sure we all were following Elbridge Colby's confirmation hearing pretty closely, but you do now see some people begin to talk about, Taiwan falls, it's so tragic, but then putting our military force to really try to defend Taiwan may outweigh the benefits of its cost, right? So we definitely have begun to get mixed messages on this. Coincidentally, Secretary of Defense Hegseth is on his way to visit the Philippines first and then Japan. I'm actually watching very closely what kind of discussion he'll be having with his Filipino and Japanese counterpart while he's in the area, while he could come home very much land in hot water on this, what we're now calling here as a signal gate. Some of us have, quite frankly, joke is like, what if this will be his first and only foreign trips as a defense secretary, depending on how things roll. A lot of eyes are on what Secretary Hegseth may say and also may not say. Let me finish up quickly, touching upon what Alice brought up, which is very, very important point. Bart and Alice and I were all kind of more or less in an agreement that China has been a very kind of a driver by shaping the regional countries' perception, what the China's impact on the region, undesirable part of it, unpreferable part of it, types of the preferable international order that we all want to preserve. But the flip side of the coin is that the only thing that's holding the countries together? This is one big if, that, like Alice alluded to this in her opening remarks, where there are nuances about views on China, how they would like to engage. And I've been flagging this all along, especially under Trump administration. If the U.S. administration bends so hard in terms of economic decoupling with China, most of the countries in Indo-Pacific, and certainly Japan included, will be on a very tight spot in terms of figuring out, on one hand, they do not want to upset its existing trade relations with the US and economic ties with the US, which are quite deep. But at the same time, most of these regional countries and, Japan, Australia, and most of Europe too, I would argue that we all have economic relations with China in some sort, especially in the commercial sector. And with this very kind of a blurring line between what's considered defense technology, what's not, is that decoupling in the true sense of the word feasible even? Mm. And what if that is really the point what if we really start, U.S. administration really start pushing this onto its allies and partners? I think Biden administration kind of took that first step through domestic laws like CHIPS Act and so forth, but Trump administration could go even harder. So that's one big open question that it's, obviously we're within less than 100 days. So we'll have to see on this one, but I'll just flag those.
Yuki, thanks for mentioning Taiwan. A question to Alice and Bart from what Yuki's just said. Do you think that the minilaterals that Japan is pursuing and that the US and Japan are working together on, are they effective in stopping an emergency in Taiwan, do you think? Alice, perhaps we start with you.
The answer would vary depending on which minilateral framework we are talking about. Obviously, if we are thinking about a minilateral like the Quad, the type of role that the Quad, given how it is structured now, the type of role that the Quad can sustain to prevent a crisis in the Taiwan Strait, I think it's limited. Because the Quad, because of its nature, how it has evolved over the past 4 years, the emphasis has been more on non-traditional, soft kind of security issues. It does not necessarily function as a regional military deterrent in the traditional form. What these mechanisms can contribute is up to discussions, obviously. Other type of approaches or other minilateral frameworks may be more conducive to what you were alluding. And I'm thinking about, for example, trilateral cooperation with Australia, cooperation with the Philippines in this regard. The question is, what kind of action are they trying to deter? I see the value of minilateral frameworks is the fact that they do not necessarily work as traditional forms of deterrence, and they fulfill a non-traditional role that is better suited for other types of challenges rather than the Taiwan issue.
Bart, did you have anything to add?
I tend to agree with Alice in that I don't think that any of these minilateral constructions have or can play any meaningful traditional security kind of role in preventing or stopping a Taiwan contingency. If you think about the Quad, so far has been doing very useful work, but at the same time, it has been mainly in the non-traditional security sphere. Countries like Japan and especially India have been kind of promoting a more low-key and below-the-surface kind of way of, or modus operandi in the non-traditional security sphere. So it doesn't have any real teeth, and I also don't see any further securitization of the Quad happening in the near future. India, for example, has especially been focusing on the inclusive nature of the Quad, rather keeping it, let's say, low-key and below the surface. I think the main question really is, will the US interfere in the case of a Taiwan contingency? And if yes, to what extent will Japan be involved in that? Or of course, the US bases in Japan will play a role in that case for sure, but based on the idea or the right of collective self-defense, to what extent that Japan will allow itself to get involved, I think that's the more important question here.
Question to you, Yuki. These minilaterals, they cover so many different areas from traditional security to geoeconomics and so on. And they contain varying countries and varying sizes and so on. I'm just interested in your view about Japan, where it's sitting and looks at the region. Do you think there's an overarching strategic objective guiding Japan's engagement with minilateralism, or is it more sort of opportunistic, so dealing things with issues as they arise, or is there some sort of wonderfully perfect structure that's driving all of this? What's your view?
Most of these unilaterals and trilaterals also have U.S. involvement in it. And there are a few exceptions that I think we're going to discuss later. There is a purpose in Japan making sure that U.S. is in the mix of these alphabet soups wherever it can. Japan, and I think to some extent ROK, but I don't, obviously, ROK is not the focus of the discussion today. Japan and ROK, in a very similar manner, I think faces have always faced the dilemma, the fear of abandonment and fear of entanglement. And then I think for Japan, in a strange way, both has been very pronounced. It really did start back when the first Obama administration, when President Obama first really openly admitted that U.S. no longer wishes to play world's policeman. There has been, in the strategic community at least, the sense of urgency that we have to do something to make sure that U.S. is engaged in this region. By trying to involve U.S. in these alphabet soup of all these minilaterals is one way of doing it, because it kind of plays nicely into let's do this as an alliance together, alliance plus almost like approach. So that's one thing. If you look at these different combinations from Japanese perspective, there are degree of institutionalization that comes into play with this. In this sense, I would probably highlight US, Japan, Australia as the closest to the kind of a traditional security sense of the alliances. This is purely because of the institutionalization between Japan and Australia in terms of its security cooperation, reciprocal access to each other's bases, defense technology transfer, and export and so forth. That level of institutionalization is like most advanced between these two countries bilaterally. So I would probably put US, Japan, Australia in like a little bit of a special category from Japanese perspective at least. And US-Japan ROK is special also in another way, because it does involve more directly with Japan's more urgent threat called North Korea. I would give Biden administration huge credit in terms of forcing Japan and Korea start talking to each other after years of mutual alienation. And then I think Japan and US, in a strange way, given the domestic political turmoil in South Korea, they are very concerned about what that shakes out and what types of new administration in South Korea would engage in the US-Japan ROK trilateral. I had a chance to speak with a group of Chinese scholars who focus on Japan, who visited my China studies colleague at Stimson. We spent 2 hours in the room together. And that was, I would say, the first time ever that I came out of the meeting without talking about Senkakus and talking about Taiwan. We spent bulk of the time talking about Trump 2.0. That's not a surprise. That's one of the reasons they came. Other half was really South Korea and how the domestic turmoil could impact US ROK alliance and how that could alter Japan's strategic thinking for issues such as indigenous nuclear capability and so forth. These minilaterals really kind of works as a tool that Japan could use to make sure that U.S., regardless of the trend line of the U.S. administration at any given time, there will be a certain level of U.S. engagement in this region and a focus.
To your point on South Korea, 60 years since diplomatic relations were established, it coincides with big political change in the US, the biggest domestic political crisis in South Korea since the advent of democracy in South Korea. And obviously, Japan's own political situation looks uncertain as well. We've been talking about China as one of those sort of de facto drivers of the minilateralism movements in the Indo-Pacific. But for Japan, there's sort of two sides to this. One is obviously Japan's got security concerns about China, but also Japan and China are very closely linked economically. There's a sort of symbiotic relationship there, as even Abe Shinzo said. Bart, how does Japan tread this fine line between its economic need to get on with China and also its security concerns, which are driving some of this minilateralism?
Yeah, I would say that Japan is certainly in quite a difficult position when it comes to China, an exercise in tightrope walking. If you look first of all at the security concerns, I think Japan has been doing its utmost to address these security concerns. First of all, by strengthening the alliance with the US, also by increasing its own deterrence, by raising the defense budgets, acquiring counter-strike capabilities, and so on. But I think thirdly, Japan has also quite successfully promoted the free and open Indo-Pacific idea, which is actually implicitly aimed at China, launching this construct of a broader Asia that gives a larger role to India. And it's also a region that is based on the rule of law and free and open shipping lanes. Japan then has, under that umbrella, created partnerships unilaterally, but also bilaterally with countries like India, Australia, and Southeast Asian nations that are perhaps sharing the same fears of China's ascendancy and assertive behavior. Japan has also used that umbrella and successfully promoting it of the FOIP, of the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, to reach out to Europe, and has also created strategic partnership agreements with the EU, but also with individual European countries, and bringing them into the fold of FOIP, focusing in particular on the militarily strong European countries like France, for example, and the UK, but also reaching out to the Netherlands, that then also created its own Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think that Japan has been doing quite a lot through minilateralism, but also through bilateral strategic partnerships. And by the way, Japan now has 42 of these agreements bilaterally with different countries around the world, just to give you an idea of how extensive this effort has been. So that's one side of the coin. But then, of course, you have the economic side of things. And as you say, Japan and China remain highly interdependent economically. China is still Japan's largest trading partner, to the amount of $300 billion annually, which is a lot more, about 50% more than its trade with the US. In addition to being still a key investment destination and an important source of components and materials. So I think that China remains crucial to Japanese companies as a market, and basically they're still making profit in China. So I think that will, at least in the short term, remain the case. Throughout the past 5 decades, relations with China have, of course, been fluctuating, going back and forth. But for a long time, there was this keyword of separating politics and economy, seikei bunri in Japanese. So diplomatic relations were tense and cold, but economic relations were warm and thriving. That situation has certainly started changing as of the 2010s. And you can say that perhaps today the security tensions certainly have the upper hand, but I do think that Japan is trying to find some kind of a balance. It's for now, at least, impossible to cut off ties with China. Japan, I think, is very aware of economic interdependence and also the need, very basically, to have stable relations with China. So perhaps this idea of at least partly separating economy from security is not yet entirely off the table. And I think the need for that stability was also voiced quite clearly by the most recent trilateral of the foreign ministers of Japan, China, and South Korea. That happened earlier this week, especially in the current climate, now that all three countries face pressure and tariffs from the US. So I think balancing economic interests with efforts to alleviate economic as well as geopolitical security concerns, that will remain a quite important task ahead for Japan in the years to come.
I just want to go back to a comment that was made about the Quad and securitization of the Quad. I think the comment went that further Quad securitization is unlikely. Just want to get your views on that, Alice. And if there was a securitization of the Quad, who would be the drivers of this?
I think the answer depends on, first of all, what we mean by securitized Quad. Because if we are thinking about a securitized Quad in the sense of the Quad transforming into a more traditional, formal, maybe tool of military deterrence, I don't think that is going to happen. But some members, and I'm thinking about Japan and Australia, may welcome, for example, the prioritization of some initiatives, maritime security initiatives, maybe expanding the scope of the joint naval exercises, or even maybe a naval task force. This may be easier to justify for Japan and Australia, but for India, it's a little bit of a different story. India, because of the fact that India, first of all, is not a US treaty ally. India has also been very hesitant because of its non-alignment posture and because of its more cautious stance in general towards Beijing. And we can't forget that there seems to be a recent thaw in relations as well. So I think this ability to securitize the Quad really depends on what kind of securitization we are thinking about. There's another complicating factor, which is Trump's transactional approach. Neither Japan nor India have been spared from criticism regarding trade and tariffs. The most recent tariffs announced yesterday will hit Japan's auto industry as well. While I do think there may be some benefits for enhancing cooperation on more targeted security initiatives, it really depends on how this development comes about. It could even bring risks, the risk of alienating some members, India specifically. I'm not very optimistic about the possibility of the Quad becoming a mechanism with teeth.
Yuki, I could see you nodding there. Did you want to add anything?
Quad tried the, I guess, the securitization, for lack of better words, in the realm of economic resiliency realm. If you look back on when Japan still had the Prime Minister Suga during the COVID, this is when really full countries begins to talk about this issue: vaccine distribution, vaccine development cooperation, and making sure that all the countries within that Quad framework had enough supply for its not just for its own populations, but then also they can work together to push the vaccines out to other partners. I do agree with Alice that kind of a traditional way of security cooperation in terms of more overt military exercises and so forth, India would likely be the most hesitant, not just because of India's kind of a traditional diplomatic stance of, omnidirectional diplomacy, its self-identification as a leader of a non-allied movement, but then also its relationship with Russia, which is another U.S. Strategic competitor, is also very nuanced. And that really came out clear in the initial days of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. I have heard my friends in Japan saying in this very rather lukewarm response against this invasion, does it affect the Quad moving forward? Not just about the national interest, but then, one thing that also is usually promoted in the Quad gathering is the shared values. Mm-hmm. So what does it talk about in India's strategic outlook, and then also its sense of values, if they don't really seem to be on the same page when cases like Russian aggression into Ukraine happens? Prime Minister Kishida was really trying to rally up the support for Ukraine, saying Ukraine today can be East Asia tomorrow. He really quite literally whipped around Southeast Asian leaders to kind of fall in line and support Ukraine, if you recall. That definitely does bring in the uncertainties. Australia and Japan are also, because of the unpredictability and all this oncoming tariff from Trump administration, how do we safeguard these multilaterals that all have U.S. in the alphabet soup? It was encouraging that Secretary of State Marco Rubio's first foreign ministers meeting was a Quad. Ishiba and Modi were really back-to-back the foreign leaders that visited White House. Those meetings, they were successful, positive overall, but then there were also tensions that we could kind of glean into. So I think there are still a lot of uncertainties about Quad, especially going into a more traditional security cooperation that we often think about when we talk about other groupings like US, Japan, Australia.
Moving to the outlook now for Japan and minilaterals, I think in the course of this discussion, we've kind of answered the question about the US involvement with minilaterals. One question I think is interesting, though, given the uncertainties of the US's involvement, is whether there is a place or these can be effective for minilaterals without the US. We talked about Japan's fear of abandonment, for example. What happens in the sort of worst case scenario, presumably for Japan and some of the other countries in the region where the US is just not interested? Can they be effective? Perhaps we start with you, Bart.
If you think about Japan and how it has been going about constructing this multi-layered network of strategic partners at all these different levels, bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral, and so on, very active during the past 2 decades, Japan will most likely just continue that with or without the US. It has been one way to counter this fear of abandonment, but it has also been a way for Japan to focus on certain types of cooperation with other countries in the defense sphere, defense technology transfer, joint military exercises, and so on. So I see that continuing. Perhaps there is in that field a way for Japan to take the lead instead of the US.
Yuki.
I would highlight how Japan reacted during the Trump 1.0. And mind you, this will be a big question for Japan. Back then, we had the Prime Minister Abe. Trump kind of threw the rug off of his feet when he said, okay, US will no longer in TPP. So what did Japan do? Abe really rallied the remaining countries in the region and brought it to the finish line in CPTPP. You can probably see similar reaction or similar response from Japan this time around as well. But then this time around, I think there are more partners that Japan can reach out to when Japan tries that route. Certainly, Australia will come into mind. But then if you recall, Japan has been investing a lot of efforts at the very senior level to deepen its cooperation across the globe. And basically, one of the areas that is really focusing on its defense diplomacy has been Europe, its relationship with NATO. During the Trump 2.0, Japan did sign very important trade agreements with EU as well. So I can definitely see Japan responding that way. That only way that these framework will survive, it's a fear of abandonment gets not completely appeased, I don't think, because Japan will never give up on US, if you will. It will try to probably always try to engage US in every way possible. Japan would most likely respond by deepening relationship with other US allies and partners that are feeling more or less similar way.
Which brings us nicely to GCAP. Alice, you've written on GCAP. Is GCAP a template for how other minilaterals could evolve involving Japan?
That's a great question. I think Japan has the opportunity with fluctuating US policies. Japan has opportunity now to act as a bridge between Washington and Brussels. This may be critical considering that transatlantic relations are souring. In order to do this, minilaterals that do not necessarily have the United States involved will be essential to achieve this goal. GCAP, I think, represents an interesting case. Japan will double down on its collaboration with Italy and the UK, given the high stakes involved in this project from a technology perspective, but even in terms of how this project and minilateral can sustain deeper cooperation at the security and defense level with the UK and Italy, which are important NATO members. I also think that this will not happen without uncertainties, because rhetoric coming out from Washington now creates new uncertainties and a lot of unpredictability when it comes to some of the US engagement with minilaterals. But I think that even minilaterals that do not involve the US could possibly face some pressures. One important objective with the Global Combat Air Program relates to future sales of the Finnish product. And in the long run, this objective could clash with the Trump administration transactional push for increasing the procurement by allies and partners of US military systems, or it could even compete with the newly recently announced F-47. GCAP can represent an example for pushing for new minilaterals that cut across the Indo-Pacific and Europe, but there will be challenges on how these minilaterals can navigate the US approach moving forward.
Which brings us to our Japan memo questions. 2 questions that we ask all of our guests. We always have fantastic answers, so I'm very much looking forward to what you're going to say. First question is whether you have any book recommendations for listeners who want to understand Japan better, and you are allowed to recommend your own books, your own writing. And what do you think people get wrong about Japan? Bart, let's start with you.
I would like to recommend 2 books. In origin, a historian. I've been studying some parts of the Tokugawa period, so I've become quite strongly aware of the need to understand how Japan became a modernized and westernized country, while still at the same time retaining this very strong and distinct cultural identity of itself. So in that context, I think quite a good and important and recommendable book is Marius Jensen's The Making of Modern Japan. It's a bit of an older book. It was published in 2002 already, but it does give a very good overview of how that transition, westernization, modernization happened in the Meiji period. The second book I would like to recommend is Japan's Rise as a Regional and Global Power, 2013-2023, A Momentous Decade by Gilbert Rosman and Brad Glosserman. That's quite a recent book. It was published sometime last year, I think. And I thought of this book because it gives quite a good chronological overview of this one decade that was politically stable. Basically, the administration, or the second administration under Shinzo Abe, in place as the longest serving prime minister in Japanese history from 2012 to 2020. It was also the period that Japan started looking to the Asian region in a new way and thereby launching the idea of the Indo-Pacific. It's also the decade or the era in which many of these issues that we discussed today came to the fore, such as Japan's more proactive foreign policy, this multi-layered security network, the Lattice network, and also efforts to have a more autonomous and stronger security posture on the part of Japan itself. I agree with the authors and the editors here that this decade was indeed momentous. And I think this book is quite good in helping us to understand that era.
The Making of Modern Japan, absolutely great, excellent book. I remember saving up for it when I was rather younger, because it is, as you say, a bit of an older book, and bought it in hard copy because it was pre-ebook era, I think, when it came out. So
yes, certainly. And it was quite many pages and quite pricey.
It's a yes, indeed. What do people get wrong about Japan?
The misunderstandings about Japan have improved quite a lot, and many of them are gone. But I think that Japan is still often described sometimes as a very harmonious society with people who are very well behaved, polite, and who have to follow a lot of and do follow a lot of social rules. And that is certainly the case. But what people maybe get wrong is that there is a lot of internal competition and factional strife in Japan, and that is the case in any organization or grouping. And you notice that when you live in Japan. You can think in the world of politics, the factions within the LDP, they're all based on personal loyalty to faction leaders, and a lot of competition there. And also a reason why there are so few prime ministers that last for a long time. Same competition goes on in companies, between subdivisions, subsidiaries, and so on. Ministries, agencies that are competing for monetary allocations or for influence and so on. You even find it in cultural organizations. Think of kabuki, tea ceremony, ikebana, all those things, all those different schools, they compete quite a lot for prestige as well as students. And of course, in the academic world as well, working at a Japanese university, you easily come across this kind of factional strife. And the competition between different clans, so to say, led by prominent professors, for example. Yeah. So the idea of competition, I think, is sometimes neglected, and maybe it's not so different from what is happening here or in Europe or in the West. But perhaps there is, in the case of Japan, quite a strong discrepancy with the image that we have of Japan as harmonious and devoid of competition, and then what is actually going on with a lot of competition on the ground.
Thank you. Alice.
I think this was the most difficult questions that we got today, because there are so many books that I would like to recommend. I chose one book that I just finished reading a few weeks ago by Dr. Bhupinder Singh, Reconstructing Japan's Security Policy. Professor Singh evaluates the threat construction process in Japan through the lens of external military crisis. And the reason why I'm recommending it is because I think it provides a comprehensive understanding of how Japan's security policy and defense policy has evolved, but it does so through a constructivist lens, so looking at how external military crises have been utilized in the domestic discourse to legitimize these changes. I think it's a really good resource for students who may be new to the study of Japan, but also for those who want to better understand not just the evolution of Japan's defense policy, but also the evolution of the security discourse in Japan. And regarding the other question, what people get wrong about Japan, I think Japan is often underestimated by people, especially those who do not closely follow global affairs. This may have changed. There is still a strong perception that because of Japan's constitution and history, Japan is a pacifist country and therefore it is a weak country. I've heard many times the remarks that say that Japan doesn't really have a military. Based on what we discussed today, I think that Japan is a significant economic, diplomatic, and technological influence. It's one of the largest world economies, a leader in innovation, a key contributor to international organizations. So I think it's a much more influential player in global affairs than what it is commonly acknowledged.
Great answers. Thank you, Alice. Last comments to you, Yuki, books and what people get wrong.
This is, again, so hard. There are so many of my mentors' work that I think of it as essential, but if I really have to choose these four, and those are all very kind of older books. Two of those are about Japanese politics. One is by my old mentor, Dr. Nat Bowman Thayer's book called How the Conservatives Rule Japan. And if you read that book with another Japanese book that are, books on Japanese politics that deal with more recent political dynamism by Gerald Curtis at the Columbia University, Jerry's Logic of Japanese Politics. If you read those two books in tandem, that gives you such a great explanation of what you may see and hear in Japanese politics today and how some of those old tradition really dies hard in Japanese politics. In terms of this perception about Japan is pacifist country, still there are some of those cultural norms that are really hard for Japanese themselves to get out of. 2 books on that realm. One is one of my colleagues, Tom Berger at the Boston University, his book on the culture of anti-militarism and the Japanese military. This is a comparative study between Japan and Germany and how public of the each country dealt with the end of the war, defeat of the war, and how they looked for accountabilities for the reason for the defeat and how that might be translated into their cultural norms in terms of hesitance of sending troops overseas, hesitance about seeing their own military out and active in a kind of offensive way. And really the heart of that, I would really have to go back to the historian John Dower's Embracing the Defeat. This is really focused on Japanese populace, how they quite literally embrace the unconditional surrender. It is an amazing chronology of Japanese people's resilience in that face of that unconditional surrender. What they had believed in was literally, taken away from them overnight over the short radio speech by the emperor. And how they picked up themselves, and also not to mention the devastation of all these fire bombings that was happening toward the end of the war, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, how they picked themselves up from those and then became where Japan is today. If I have to recommend one book for specifically in Japanese history, then that will be that. What do people get wrong about Japan? This could be a little bit controversial, but 2 things. One is the role of women in Japanese society. I think the perpetual perception out in the West is Japanese women are kind of this oppressed being. You talk to any Japanese successful businessman, they don't fear their company president. They fear their wives. Many of them are put on the stipend that's controlled by their wives. And they're allotted every day a certain budget, and they actually have to go and beg her to dispense extra with the justification of it. And that actually does still remain the case, even at this age where both husband and a wife works. And of course, there are a number of barriers that Japanese women continue to face today. So I don't mean to belittle that at all. I mean, there are truly structural barriers that Japan is so far, far behind. But once it gets inside of their homes, wives are often the people that wears truly the pants. I mean, they have the power of purse. They have the access to the children in every sense of the word. That's one thing. Another thing is Japanese method of communication. I think it's quite backwards from what we're used to seeing here in the West, where it's much more indirect and it's very nuanced. It's not like they're not expressing themselves. They just have a very different, subtle way of making their point. They are nuanced and they're very subtle. They don't like confrontation. That is true. But they have a way with their words in making themselves abundantly clear if they disagree with you. But sometimes I think because those no's and I don't disagree with you doesn't come right in the first sentence, that often gets quite literally lost in translation.
Thank you, Yuki. So that book, the John Dower's Embracing Defeat, that is the most recommended book of all of our, I think, nearly 50 episodes that we've done. That one is the most recommended. So, and I agree, absolutely brilliant book. So good to hear it being recommended again. But all of your recommendations, all really good. There'll be lots of reading material for those of us that want to know more about Japan. Which brings us to the end of this session. So thank you so much, Bart, Yuki and Alice, for a really rich discussion. So much appreciation to all of you. To our audience, please do follow our guests on X or Twitter or wherever they may be on social media. The details of how to find them will be on the show notes. And thank you, as ever, audience, for joining us for another episode of Japan Memo. If you have any comments or feedback, please contact us by email on japanchair@iiss.org, and Japan Chair is one word. And if you enjoyed this episode, we urge you to subscribe to Japan Memo on the podcast platform of your choice. And for more insightful analysis, I also encourage you to look at past research from the Japan Chair programme and from the IISS more broadly on our website. Thank you, audience, and see you next time. Goodbye.